It is hypocritical of the respondents to violate the law, but then say that the petitioner should have done something to stop them from violating the law. This was one of the poignant views put forth by Senior Counsel Douglas Mendes in the election petition case as he made his closing statements on Wednesday at the High Court in Charlestown to wrap up his case for the petitioner, the Honorable Mark Brantley of the Concerned Citizens Movement CCM. At the start of his discourse, he reminded the court that every effort should be made to corroborate the laws with the Constitution of the land. He spelled out the importance of the right to vote, suggesting that it does not matter who the individual is. The right to vote is so fundamental, every effort must be made to ensure it is done. Senior Counsel Mendes referred to the sections and subsections in the National Assembly's Act, which clearly outlines the duties of the Chief Registration Officer and Supervisor of Elections to prepare and publish the revised monthly list, and the duty of the Registration Officer to publish a list of objections, to send out notices immediately, which would provide 5-day notice for persons who they were intended for. He listed the many violations admitted in full view of the court by the witnesses, outlining that notices of objections were not published as regulated by law. Notices of objections for a hearing were not sent out immediately. 140 notices were not sent out either on time or were not received by the persons intended at all, and which was known by the registration officer who sent them out. There were no revised monthly lists published or prepared. Senior Counsel Mendes asserted, based on what Parliament intended, when the Constitution was framed, it was done in order to facilitate a person's ability to vote and not to have them disenfranchised. For each violation, Senior Counsel Mendes used a plethora of cases which addressed the matter. One matter he dealt with heavily was the duty of the registration officer to ensure that the notice of objections were sent out in enough time so that the objectee would be able to prepare themselves for a hearing. He underscored that the registration officer did not send the notices out in reasonable time and knowingly sent out notices after the hearing date, made decisions, and did not publish the decisions as prescribed by the law, which would give persons who were affected the right to appeal the decision. He reminded the court that the only evidence provided was the list to be used for the elections, just 5 working days before the local elections. He said the registration officer acted in bad faith when she carried out her actions. The element of bias was also dealt with. Senior Counsel Mendes reminded the courts that the registration officer admitted to being a supporter of the NRP, providing them with financial advice, attending executive meetings, and even being a polling agent for the Honorable Hensley Daniel. He reminded the courts that all correspondence by leader and deputy leader of the Concerned Citizens Movement were ignored by the registration officer and supervisor of elections. He stated that registration officer suffered from a state of mind which she could not show impartiality. He put it to the court that the registration officer and supervisor of elections committed misfeasance in public office, which is the improper and unlawful execution of an act that is in itself lawful and proper. At the time, he added, "I don't want to press you that these violations satisfy criminal offense." He added that this violation of the law that denied 203 people the right to vote caused serious harm. He expressed strongly that there was a deliberate attempt by the supervisor of elections and registration officer not to perform their duties, and continued to say if it was not done deliberately, it was done as a reckless act. In speaking to the margin of votes, Mr. Brantley lost by 14. Senior Counsel Mendes reminded the court of the many witnesses who came forward, stating that they would have voted for the Honorable Mark Brantley. He noted that, taking into consideration the small margin of 14, the 203 expunged names would have affected the outcome of the election. It is important to note here that, to our knowledge, the respondents or government side did not file evidence with the courts of anyone who wished to vote for the Honorable Hensley Daniel in the July polls but were denied that opportunity. It was foreshadowed by Premier of Nevis when he stated in an address to ring the bell on June 22, 2011, "If anybody come to you and say they can't vote for NRP because of the list, they are not NRP, and they don't intend to vote for NRP. They're just out to confuse and create confusion in your mind, and you need to ignore them." Senior Counsel Mendes stated in closing that the registration officer and supervisor of election dodged their responsibilities, which prevented people the right to vote and the right to appeal, and the election should be declared invalid. Closing arguments continue on Thursday with statements from the respondents' side, Anthony Astafan SC and Dr. Henry Brown.